The other thing you have to do here is work with escaped underlay. This is the one that sometimes people will come to me and they're like, man, my lettering keeps getting outlined and I didn't put an outline in it. This is edge run underlay. The thing is, people kind of talk bad about edge run underlay. I'm going to talk about when you need it and when you absolutely don't. But frequently what we have is edge run or contour underlay, which is an underlay that runs just inside the edge of a column before the rest of it runs. If you shift a little bit before you run your column or you don't inset it deeply enough inside the column, you'll frequently get what I always call the marching ants that are walking next to your design. These are incredibly hard to pull out, so really it's about making sure that you have enough inset, and we'll talk about that. Inset or pull compensation can help this. But materials or garments that shift easily when it's not set back far enough from the edge of the finished column is where you get this escaped edge underlay. What can we do about it? Two different things. And it depends on what we like about the rest of the file. If we're looking at this piece here and we're like, all right, I think this is also too thin. This doesn't look bold enough. It doesn't look like what I wanted that lettering to look like. In that case, what we're going to do is increase our pull compensation. Because what's pull compensation do? It just lengthens each of the stitches. So if we have a column that has those inset lines of underlay just inside the edge, if we lengthen the stitches, we use the pull compensation setting, the underlay stays in the same place, but the edges of the satin move out, which means we now have a larger gap between the edge and where those edge run underlays run. So we can use pull compensation if we are not happy with how thin the lettering looks. Otherwise, the problem being, people will start trying to do editing for this, right? They'll say, all right, let's grab the edges and pull them out. If it's an automated underlay in the system that you're using, the underlay will move with that edge. So if you just start trying to make it wider by grabbing the points and moving those points out, you're going to end up with the underlay travels with it. Then you have to change the setting. But if you're not happy with the thickness and you just want to get a thicker column and you've got some of those little marching ants, increase the pull compensation and you can actually have it tuck those in. Also, if the column appears to be the correct width, now we have a settings issue. If you have the original font that you're working from, if you are working on the original digitizing piece and you've got the object, you can change the inset or margin, depends on your software what this might be called, for your edge underlay to tuck it under further. So in this case, we only had it tucked under maybe 0.4 mils. In this case, I've set it up for 0.8 mils of inset. I'm just driving that further in. If you are on small enough lettering, you don't have anything like sawtoothing at the edges, really small lettering, we can often just go straight stitch underlay, so center run instead. And on really smooth materials, if we don't have high contrast, we can drop the underlay entirely on some things. I usually won't do that. Also because when I'm digitizing for somebody else, I know that they tell me they're going to run on that, but later they're going to run on something else. So I want some underlay to be under there to support my material. So center run underlay can help, but like I said, some people just tear out the underlay every time. They're like, all right, tear out the underlay. I would like to reconsider that because edge run underlay actually does have a job that it does. Edge run or contour underlays shore up edges. So one thing I'll tell you about density, if we look at a satin stitch as it goes around a curve, the outer edge of the density is always less dense than the inner edge of the curve. Because of that, we've got more gaps on the outer edge, and sometimes it is the underlay that provides the color coverage. Also, if we start to see sawtoothing, let's say we have a textured garment and individual threads are kind of landing against the texture, so we're getting sawtoothing and issues. Having an underlay next to that can have them provide like a rail for them to grab onto. So as the stitches pull in under tension, they grab onto the rail of that edge run, especially if we're on something that is very meshy or textured, and they keep the line of the edge run. So if you're seeing sawtoothing, you're seeing texture you don't want, you don't necessarily want to remove the edge run, especially on wider satin stitches that are curving. So think about taking that out and don't worry too much about it. Removing it can reduce stitch quality. Yes, we can remove it and it'll remove, of course, the underlay popping out, but you might also see some extra color breaks in the edges and some quality issues in the edges that you don't like. If you see those, then just think about increasing your inset. However, there's one place where I get to say this right out. I'm not even going to debate this one. I told you guys there's multiple ways to do this. This is the one where I'm not going to debate and I'm just going to say it. If you have a 3D foam design, take out any edge run underlay on it. Why is this? Every time I'm working with somebody, they're telling me that they can't clean up their 3D foam. They're like, got all these bumps of foam sticking out the side. They don't. They have edge run underlay. Somebody who's digitizing has decided to use edge run underlay to try and pre-cut the foam, and then the little loops fall off the edge of the foam, and when they sew the top stitching, there's a bunch of little loops of thread sticking outside of that 3D foam edge. This has happened to me so many times that I no longer equivocate. If I see edge run underlay in a 3D foam design, I take it out. Edge run underlay does not belong there. We're supposed to cut that foam with the top stitching, not with the underlay stitching, and in my opinion, it's just not worth it because most of the places where we use 3D foam Caps. Caps are one of the least stable things that we stitch on. So the chances of us moving away from that underlay and then coming back and filling on it and having it shift a little bit are really high. So this one I say, yeah, no, just remove it. If it's on your 3D foam design, you're having any kind of edge quality problems, take any of that underlay out. It doesn't belong there. Now there's some common density issues. We see this little PW here and we're seeing some show through and some issues, this high contrast white on black. This is something that happens pretty frequently. The thing is, most people just try and pack extra density in there to make that close up. They think that they've got a spacing problem with those lines. But there's other things we can do to fix density. So let's talk about that a little bit. First thing, I'm going to make a definition because I use some terms that other people don't use. I like to define something different about two-dimensional density versus 3D density. When we're talking about a digitizer, we're talking with them about a file, we're always talking about what I call two-dimensional density, which is where we're looking at a file, and we're talking about the spacing between the lines. That is common. That's what we're usually worried about. On the surface of the design, how close together are those lines? And that's going to tell us how much coverage we have. However, we're going to get into three-dimensional density in a minute, and I just want to tell you what I mean by that. 3D density refers to me how close together all the stitch penetration points are through the material. When we're working on this stuff, especially if we come from the world of print, we will sometimes forget that we are jabbing a needle thousands and thousands of times through our fabric and leaving behind 2 wedges of thread every time we do, so that thread is building up through the stack of stabilizer and material. And we're forgetting that that has an effect on the garment. And that's what I call 3D density, how much stuff is poked through an area so that we're driving these wedges into our material that distort it. So excessive density through our garments can lead to some distortion that changes the way the fabric lies, and I'll show that to you again in a moment. But let's go back real quickly to 2D density. This is the stuff we're mostly dealing with when we're talking about our digitizing or with our digitizers. We have issues of sparse coverage. Certainly, top stitching can have insufficient density, meaning that we don't have enough rows of thread close enough together to get coverage. This is a swatch test I did with testing some polyester spun thread. Started at 50% density and worked up to 100% density as specified by the maker. You can see that there are levels of coverage you might be happy with that aren't at that full tilt density. This is also why another digitizing issue I've talked about. People will tell me, oh, I've got a great digitizer, but you know, I found out everything was a lot finer and the coverage was still good if I moved to entirely 60 weight thread. This means your digitizer is using 25% more density than they need to. You are using 25% more stitch count than you need to. You have a digitizing problem in that case, not a thread problem. We can see that as we move through this, yes, of course, making things go close together. You also do see that I have an underlay here that's supportive. But as we make the file, of course, get denser, it is going to get better coverage. So sometimes we do have to increase that coverage, that's true. But once we are nearing that full density for 40 weight thread, that's going to be 0.4 millimeters or 4 embroidery points, I'm going to encourage you not to tell people to go much beyond that. Because once we go much beyond that, we're talking about threads not just laying next to each other, but starting to be on top of each other. When they roll off of each other, we get more push distortion and we get texture in our fills, texture in our satins. So if we start pushing way too far beyond laying the threads next to each other, we're going to end up with excessive textures and distortions as we do it. So think about adding structural underlay or increasing the density of the underlay. As you can see, the underlay does a lot of the work of also covering up some of that color and of holding up the stitches. Remember, we're building a three-dimensional object where we're laying thread on top of thread. We are also raising that top layer off of that base material, which is going to help it show through less. So fill underlay, when we are on fills, a standard fill underlay that is at 90 degrees to that top fill is a really good way to help that get more support. Prevents show through in large filled areas and adds coverage without the bulk of excess density. The other thing I'm going to tell you is when we talk about 3D density in a minute here, instead of continuing to jam those in that same angle and cause that stress to be going on the same direction that we would, we're now putting some of that stress in a different direction. So we're not causing as much distortion, we're not pushing that fabric all in the same direction as it runs. So we will also have less distortion by adding more underlay. So in this case, I'll show you a baseline of the fill like this. It's literally just a fill stitch. And by the way, even if you're working on somebody else's file, you can use your digitizing software at the right time in the design and drop a fill underneath an unsupported fill, and you can create your own underlay. It is the same as a fill stitch with a really wide, broad, open density. So you want to make sure it's inset on the edges, no less than 0.4 mils. And I like to use a very lofty 3 to 4 millimeter stitch length. Why? The longer the stitch, the more it holds up above the design. The shorter the stitch, the tighter the tension, it will sink into the fabric. Longer stitches are loftier and hold up. Shorter stitches sink in and pull down. So lofty stitch length and 3 to 4 or 30 to 40 point density as a baseline for most of my fill underlays. But this is the secret trick that I like to use all the time. And it's not a secret anymore. When I first started, you only had one automatic underlay on any shape. Now you can do these very regularly. I call this a mesh fill underlay. You may see this called a double tatami underlay. If you're having a ton of trouble with coverage, essentially this is two of the underlays I just showed you, one at 45 degrees and one at 135 degrees to the top angle. So if we're dead horizontal, it would be 45 and 135 underneath. What you can see about this mesh is that every time a stitch runs across this, it's sitting on top of at least a couple rows of underlay in every angle, and we have a lot of support. It's causing that color coverage, but it's also spreading out fabric underneath it, holding it down, and giving you a nice platform to run on. We look at these two pieces here. These are identical except for the underlay. The top one has a standard fill underlay, and we still see some show through. The bottom one has the mesh fill. So it can do quite a lot. The other thing you'll see, we see this wrinkling that's going on in here. Part of that's because of directional stress. Because I filled that fill up and then back the other direction before I did my top stitching, I laid it out flat and sewed it down to the stabilizer. And it also means that I had less puckering, less problems with the distortion. So it allows for lighter densities while maintaining total coverage. So roughly the same setting as that standard fill, but twice and on the different angles. Usually though, I'm going to tell you if you're working with a file that you're doing in digitizing software, double tatami, square underlay, something like that will exist. So you usually will have a base setting for this that you don't have to do this yourself. And now I get to tell myself one more time, unfortunately. So poor young Eric gets to cry about a bad sample in front of you. The designs can become convex or concave. So what do we have is the dreaded thread taco, the potato chip, when it looks like a gremlin is reaching out of someone's shirt and grabbing the design from the back. A lot of this happens because of density issues. If you see that potato chip design on someone you've run stuff before, what you're going to notice is the center of that hinge is usually the angle of fill for the biggest filled area in your piece. Designs becoming overly filled in density will give it that excessive stitches into spreading the fabric out. So watch this. When we're working at that same angle, you end up with something like this. When this is laying flat on the table, it looks like this. It's raised up in the center. Why is this? Because young Eric started trying to blend some threads together for the different fibers, and I ran a full black fill and another fill and then another fill, all at the same angle. And once I had like triple densities in some of those areas, I'm jamming all those needles through that design and leaving these wedges, and the fabric has nowhere to go. Fabric is fully filled. It is opaque. It's the reason why it's on us. It's to cover us up. You can't see through it. There's no space for all that thread. So what happens? As we drive those little wedges, the fabric has to get out of the way, and the only way it has to go is up or down. And so we get ripples, convex, concave surfaces, the potato chip, the gremlin, the bacon, all the things that you can talk about designs going poorly. But you can see that the major angle of the fill is this angle, and that's where that hump is. Because as I've sewn this as well, my push is going in the same angle all the time. And so I'm pushing fabric out to both sides as I sew. So cupping and dishing is often from excessive density all in that single angle. If I had used underlay to shore this up instead and back down my densities, I wouldn't have seen quite so much distortion. You're often going to see some, but the most is when you're overly packing in coverage in the same angle. What I'm going to tell you is you really want to reduce densities wherever you can. Employ structural underlay and remove overlapped layers in the same stitch angle where you can. You don't always want to remove every overlap, but fill on top of fill at full densities is just a big no-no. You don't want to do that if you don't have to. At the edges, yes. A full area of it, I probably wouldn't. Pardon me. But here's the thing I'm going to show you about this design sample real quick. Every time I show people these things, they're like, really, Eric, are you constantly making these samples and making these little patches and swatches? Here's why this is important. This particular swatch, I was doing a bunch of designs that we were running all black on these khaki aprons, and I wanted to see just how little I could get away with. So I went ahead and started with 50% fill here down to 100% fill. This is 0.4 mils, this is 0.8. As we went through this swatch test, really simple swatch test, I realized I'm pretty happy with this level of coverage. This is 18% less stitching than the one that's down here on the right, and it's less distorted. What would you do if you had 18% more of your day back or extra runs on the end of your production line? This stuff is actually important enough to worry about. If your digitizer is using 25% too much density and you're switching everything to 68 threads, it's wasting your time and it's reducing your profitability. So reducing density is important. Also, it means that things are pliable. You can't usually take everybody's jacket backs and fold them. You can take a jacket back like this from me and crush it up in your hand and let it back out. This wears nicely, feels good as a garment, and now it's something that feels good to wear. And that's part of the experience your customer has. So reducing densities is good if you're having those potato chipping, that gremlin that's grabbing the design. It's going to release that out and have a much better drape and hand, and it leads to a more high quality feel to your garment. But density, by the way, is beyond just fills. Density is not just for fills. One thing I try and tell people is not just a setting when we're looking at details, that is also density, because it's just the relative closeness of stitch lines. This is a piece that I digitized that was done entirely manually, so none of this stuff was done with fills, but as we can see that it does build up to coverage. And once again, even though this is a piece that a lot of people like from me, I always look at this and the side of the nose drives me nuts. Why? I got these lines too close together and I made my own fill. It's too dark. It's not supposed to be that dark right there, and it was because I got too slavish to making sure all the lines showed up. Truth of the matter is, no matter where we are, we can always measure density. And by the way, if you're learning to digitize and you want to know what somebody's density is in a file, or if you want to call somebody out with your digitizer, they're like, no, it's normal density. Here's how you tell. Every tool, every kind of editing tool, every type of previewing tool will have a measurement option. Usually it's under the M key. We can grab a ruler, and on any fill, we measure from one line across the second to the third, and that measurement in millimeters is the density. In this case, we're looking at a fully filled 40 weight coverage fill. It's probably about 0.4 millimeters, pretty standard, or 4 embroidery points. Same thing on satin, we move from edge to edge. And the way I always call this is by courses. We've got the line that goes perpendicular across the satin stitch, and then the angled return. We want to move over from the line across the return to that third line. When we measure that, that should be the density of the file. But the thing is, that's the same as lines that we're looking at on screen. So if we see that there are lines that are too close together in a design, even if it's detail lines, we know that somebody has accidentally built a fill. So if we put too much detail in something, we will create coverage, and a coverage will be just like a fill no matter how we started with our design. So when are details too dense? This is just a baseline. You probably want to go larger than this to get more air between the lines, but single straight stitch lines should be more than 0.5 millimeter apart. Doubled lines more than 0.8, or you're going to start to see a fill. And this is just barely any daylight between them. If you have anything with a little bit of fuzz or the thread is a little thick, these will start to be closed up. At between 0.4 and 0.5, you're going to start seeing full coverage. So this is something I often have to deal with when I'm dealing with like badges or patches. This is something I did for a movie about the Prescott Hot Shots, and we had to reproduce this piece, but they were really intent on things. So the point of, can you get that guy's little mustache? I was like, it's 2 stitches, but all right, I'll give it a go. What people didn't notice is I did make a lot of changes to the design to get that to happen. However, there was all this detail. There are panel lines on the side of this piece. There's the ropes, and they're like, we want to really get that rope detail that's in there too, as if it was going to show. But suffice it to say, they were worried about the rope detail, and I'm like, all right, can I or can't I do it? Easy way to tell. I measure it in my file, and I'm like, okay, I know I'm going to use doubled outlines on this piece. I'm going to track in and go back around all these rope segments. So I measure from the center of this line to the center of that, and I'm like, 0.93 mils? Absolutely, I can make that work. It'll show up. Because I know that when I'm at that distance that it's not going to close up and look like a fill. So I said, yes, we can do that detail. Then they were like, what about the ladder on the side of the truck? And I'm like, there's a ladder on the side of the truck? Suffice it to say, I'm like, well, I mean, I can, but when I look at the piece, there are these single lines that look more like panel lines, and they're 0.46 millimeters apart. If I run individual stitches across that, what am I going to do? I'm going to have a fill. It's just going to be a bar. It's going to look like a satin stitch. And in fact, even the one that I finally did, it doesn't look perfect because a little bit of tension difference will make this also pull together and be too loopy. So 0.46 millimeter gap between those panels, I'm like, that's not going to show. No, I'm not going to get anything out of that if I try and just do every single line. The thing is, when you have engraving style lines like the stuff that I showed you on that apron or this piece here, you can literally just skip them. Because the customer is not counting rungs on the ladder. Even if they asked about the ladder, they just want a hint that it's there. They're not going to be like, there's 11 now. Nobody's doing that. And if they do, kick them out of the shop. Like, get out of here. Judge the things at the handshake distance. If a customer grabs something and puts it in their face like this to judge it, stop them and grab their arm. Because if somebody walked up to you and did this to your shirt, you'd slap them. It's not the way that we actually view this stuff. We view it at 3 to 5 feet. That's what we actually view this stuff. So you can just delete the alternate lines, just be like, all right, every other rung. I'm gonna do one, skip one, do one, skip one, until we get to a spacing that's actually gonna work. And you do the same thing with detail lines like this in the face, and that's what I should have done on the side of the nose, but I got zoomed in and I forgot to think about it. That's also why we have to maintain grid lines and know what zoom level we're at so we know what size we're working at. So, detail density, eventually, did I get it, including a little mustache? Yes. I also blew this guy's head up by 200% and they never noticed. He's got a little mustache though, you better believe. So the next thing we have is sequencing and pathing problems. Sequence issues aren't just jumps, trims, and color changes. Yes, they can be. There's a lot of digitizers who get lazy and there's jumps and trims all over the place. But the other problems we can have, puckering, rippling, pardon me, shifting, poor registration, stuff like that can get worse if you don't think about the sequencing or pathing. And one of the places I see it a lot is with really large jacket back designs. People want to be efficient about color changes, and I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we have hot air balloons in the air for the big festival, the Fiesta. And so I have made umpteen like giant balloons made of a million colored squares. So ask me how I know about color changes. Problem we have is you'll think, all right, I've got some orange in here. I'm going to jump back and forth between this on the jacket back, between the buzzard and the orange that's here. I'm going to jump back and forth and do some color here and some color here, color here, color here. The more we shift in a hoop, the more we move and the more distortion, so the more sewing we do before we get back to outlining something, the more chance that the outline's not going to land. So if we have a fine straight stitch outline that is part of the character in the middle of the face for this buzzard, if I go back and forth over and over, especially on what they chose, which is this heinous coach's jacket that they ran it on, so this is quilted, multi-layer, and it's smooth and slippery. This thing was trying to come out of the hoop at every available occasion. What does this mean? Sometimes you have to isolate things. I ran the entirety of the balloon by itself, then I ran the text, then I ran the buzzard. If we isolate to quadrants and move as little as possible between the colors and the outlines, there's less chance for problems happening. So, like I said, we have to resequence for isolation. And this also happens with bordered large letters. I won't push this too far because we've got a lot going on before we finish. But this happens on hats a lot of the time where people will start to run all of one color entirely. They'll run CE gold, CS gold, CE black, CS black. By the time you get back to the CS black, you've run 3/4 of the design and it has shifted that hat around a lot and the outlines won't hit. If you're on a super stable cap, you might be able to get away with CS gold, CS black, CE gold, CE black. You could run one color at a time on half. Sometimes that'll work. If you've got a hat that is really shifting, give up the efficiency, run each letter by itself. CC, SS, CC, EE. Run the elements individually and you just won't have that problem. Is it going to take longer? Yes. Are you going to have more color change time? Yes. Price it accordingly if you get a ton of these and the people keep asking for hats that shift a lot. Add to it if you have to. Same thing can happen with like ripples and pinching. And I'll try and make this pretty short. When we're on performance materials, a lot of the time, people will run from left to right, and they have that same problem like hats do, where you build up material on that front of that presser foot as it runs, and we'll get ripples. Running from center out can often help that. I did a design for this performance material here, and it was constantly rippling, but when I did the piece, I ran it like a hat. I did this red dot first, and then ran out to the back of the M, then I ran the INCO out the other direction. Running center out, it's like a tablecloth. You spread out those ripples in front of you and you sew it down. Also, remember these are sewing machines. That lets you use the design to sew it to the stabilizer as it runs. You don't always have to use adhesives. Some of these really difficult pieces, a little bit of spray adhesive between the material and the stabilizer makes a big difference. But the big deal here is stitching away from the existing design. If I start stitching towards something, like let's say I stitch into this gap and then I stitch this direction toward this again, I'm going to take the material and crash it. I'm going to make a wave, and I've already stitched down one area, and I'm going to pinch that wave into it, meaning I'll have a big ripple where those things come from both directions. Always move out from things that have already been sewn down if you can. Other thing we can do for that is using underlay. I like to call this a global attachment underlay. If you have a design where you can get something entirely underneath it, you can do very simple underlays, like a running stitch shaped underlay that runs from the center of the design out to the edges. Something like this on a fully covered design, a star underlay, starts here in the center, goes out to the edges, and then down to the bottom where we start our fill. All this does is spread out the material, sew it down to the stabilizer. Often though, you'll be with designs that don't have that space. You'll have shapes like this. Just running a small underlay that goes under all of these pieces as much as you can from the center out can hold it down. Some really terrible materials, yes, we want to use action back, something else that's going to help the backing. And by the way, woven backings, always 2 layers. One straight, one at 45, because they have a weak ankle, just like the other woven materials we talked about. But we can use this to fuse it down and stitch everything in place before we start running the heavy details. So when we're investigating interactions, we just have to say, no matter what you think a flaw is, we want to look to interactions between those variables. Digitizing and settings, machine operation and maintenance, garment and support materials. Look for where these things are causing issues. Do we have enough stabilizer? Is it stable? Does it move too much in the hoop? Does it stretch too much? Is the machine operating correctly? Are we going too fast? Are we running full tilt and so we're getting a little bit of erratic behavior? Or is the digitizing not looking up to par now that we know more about density and things like that? So last thing is smart testing. I'm gonna go through it really fast. This is just the way that I like to see people test and how I do things when I'm doing editing myself. Stitch your design on the proper materials, watching the run and noting problems. S. And yes, trust me, multi-million-dollar shop every single time. So this means build it into your time schedule. It needs to be done. M, measure any registration errors or distortion you have. We've got a gap here because my lovely operators put this thing on a Carhartt sweater or a sweatshirt after it was on a really flat jacket. Measure that gap that you need to correct in your sample. Analyze it. Say, all right, this fill is all going in this direction, so it's pulling. I need to pull this edge out, and I can see that this just meets on screen. Perfection on screen is distortion on the machine. I know that's not going to be right. Analyze the way it's put together and determine why the error happened. R, rework the design. I have to grab the edge of that fill and pull it out by the distance of that gap so I can just hit that border. And then T, test again. And yes, I'm saying test again. Does that hurt sometimes with a jacket back like this? Absolutely. Does it hurt worse to run 12 of them at once and have to replace them all? Absolutely. So yes, I mean test again, watching how carefully, especially if it's only one area of the design. Now we don't have to necessarily watch everything like a hawk. We can get to that point of the design where it was going off and go back and watch and make sure it's running correctly. And tips for testing, last thing, change one variable at a time. If you go in and do this, which a lot of people do, they're like, all right, I added 3 pieces of stabilizer, and then I hooped it tighter, and then I stretched it, and I put some glue on it, and then I changed the digitizing settings, and then I added pull compensation. Even if it comes out right, which one of those things fixed it? You don't know. So when you're experimenting, as much as you can, change one variable at a time so that you don't end up correcting multiple things or go through the rest of your life with a stack of cardboard underlay of all this material under things because that's what they told you to do to make it stable. You might not need all that stabilizer, but if you've only ever run 4 pieces, you might not know that you can get away with 1. So do your experiments by changing one variable at a time and check it out. Also, document everything. As you're working, write it down. You think you will remember, especially if your digitizing station or editing station is somewhere far away from your machines, write it all down because you'll be happy that you did. And frankly, this is also stuff you can refer to again when you're trying to fix a similar problem. And I'll say this, even for somebody who thinks they do remember everything, sometimes I don't have to go back to the notes, but having taken the notes fixes it in my head. So document everything and make sure you have those alterations on hand. That's it, folks. All right, so I always put this up at the end. I say dream big, stay bold. Try something out, do something cool. Don't worry about ruining garments. You'll never ruin as many as I have. But it's all part of the process.